Hey guys, thanks for watching my channel today. My name's Don, and I like to talk about what it's like to fish after the age of 70. I talk a lot about bass fishing. I talk a lot about different types of fishing. Today, though, I want to talk about something that's a little different. Uh, for years, I've raised tropical fish, and probably going back close to 50 years. I've had aquariums. I've raised just about every fish you can imagine, everything from guppies to piranhas. And I can tell you, it's one of the most fascinating hobbies that I have, and I have quite a few hobbies. But one of the things that really was intriguing to me was to raise largemouth bass. And you know what I want to talk about today is really what surprised me most while I was watching largemouth bass in a large aquarium. So let me just start off by saying I usually start with bass, largemouth bass in particular, when they're fingerlings. And there's a reason for that. If you go out here and you try to catch a bass and you put him in the aquarium, I don't care how big he is. If he's 6 inches, 12 inches, if he's 5 pounds, if he's 8 pounds, you can't put him in an aquarium that's big enough that he'll survive. And I say that based on experience because for years I tried. I tried different sized fish in different sized aquariums, and every time the same thing happened. The bass instinctively would attempt to go farther than what the glass would allow them to go. And as a result, they would just keep bumping that lower lip. I mean, if you ever really look at a bass, their lower jaw extends out slightly farther than their upper jaw. And they use that quite often to butt other fish, to move objects, to push bluegills out of their bed, whatever it might be. But that becomes kind of their tool for pushing. And when they're in an aquarium, what happens is they're trying to find areas of weakness in the glass or weakness in this area they're being contained in. And so they're constantly testing the glass. They're going up against it, they're bumping it with their lower jaw. And this will go on as long as they're in the tank. They'll never stop doing it. And eventually, after a few days, maybe a week, what'll happen is that area on their jaw will get red and then it'll become bruised. Once it becomes bruised, it'll often become infected, and pretty soon you'll see a fungus that literally attaches itself to their lower jaw. Now, this fungus literally will go away if you release the fish. At least that's what I've heard. If you keep the fish and you try to treat him with medicine, you may be able to back some of the fungus off. The problem is the fish is going to keep doing that. That's all he knows. You know, he wants out of that tank. He wants to be able to swim like he did when he was in the lake. And he's not going to stop doing that. So even though you may treat him with different fungicides, it's not going to make any difference. So my advice is if you're going to raise largemouth bass in an aquarium, start with fry. Start with a bass fry that's 2 or 3 inches long. You can buy them on the internet. I've seen places on eBay you can buy them. There's a couple places in Ohio that'll sell them directly to you. The same thing holds true, though, with bluegills. You know, if you get a big old bluegill, and I've done this a few times, I've gotten a big 8, 9, 10-inch bluegill thinking that, you know, I could put him in an aquarium and he'd grow that much bigger. No, he's going to try to get out. He's going to keep hitting his face on that glass until he breaks out in some kind of a fungus. Either that or he just won't eat. I've had that happen too. Never had that happen with the bass, but I've had it happen with bluegills. So again, it's just not a good idea to start with larger fish. You know, start with fingerling. I raised bluegills for probably 4 or 5 years some time ago. And what I did is in the spring when the bluegills hatch out, I'd see schools of them, and there would be hundreds of them in the school. And I used to, I would put out a net It was kind of a wire mesh net that had a kind of a funnel on one end where they could swim in, but they really weren't smart enough to figure out how to get out. And I'd throw some bread in it or something, leave it out overnight. And I'd go back out in the morning and there'd be 20 or 30 in there. And they'd be the size of maybe a half a dollar. Um, they wouldn't be big at all, very, very small. And they're the best kind because they're so small when you put them in a tank, they don't spend all day trying to get out. They're just looking for food. And once you start feeding them, they become pretty content, to be in the tank. So again, whether it's bass, bluegills, or any other species of fish, always start with small fish. But going back to what I found, uh, I guess what surprised me most about watching bass in an aquarium, and there were quite a number of things, but what surprised me the most was the dominance of one fish. I never would put just one bass in an aquarium. I'd always start with 5 or 6. As a matter of fact, I just set up a tank last week with 6 peacock bass. And if you've watched some of my videos in the past, you probably know that I raised peacock bass in the past in a 150-gallon aquarium to the point where they actually bred. And they laid eggs, and the eggs hatched out, and I had about a dozen, 15 fry. It was a remarkable thing to see. It really was. I had raised them up from fry, where they were only a couple inches long, to, probably 10, 12, 14 inches. I don't even remember the size. And I eventually sold them because they kept growing. They kept getting bigger. And, a 150-gallon tank is the biggest tank that I really have room for. So as much as I would have liked to have kept them, I knew the only future that existed for them was for somebody to take them that had a bigger tank. And as it turned out, I sold them to a guy in Tampa, Florida, who actually had a 300-gallon tank. And my guess is he probably still has them today. They've probably grown into pretty good sized fish, and I'm sure he's enjoyed them this whole time. But going back to the largemouth, I would have 5 or 6 fish in there, and they would all be fingerlings, and I'd watch them as they grew. And I'd start them off usually on a diet of maybe insects, maybe small worms, red worms, sometimes maggots, sometimes wax worms, mealworms. A bass will eat just about anything. And it takes a little while for them to get accustomed to being fed because they're used to chasing their food, tracking their food. And this is a whole different ball game for them that they're not really wired for. As you drop food in, they're just not going to attack it the same way that they might attack, let's say, a small fish. A lot of times I'll buy guppies, or I'll go down to the lake and I'll catch some mosquito fish or small guppies that I find all over the shoreline. And they love them, and they chase those. So it gives them some good exercise. And you'd be surprised how many they can eat. Even a small fingerling can probably gulp down, 8 or 10 of them. And bass are so greedy, such monsters when it comes to eating, that it doesn't matter if it's a worms or live fish. They'll eat so many that they'll hold some in their jaws until they can swallow them. And more than once, I've seen them open their mouth and the fish will swim out. Or I've seen, especially with night crawlers, I'll see a night crawler crawl out of their gill and try to escape. And another bass comes along and grabs that one and drags the first bass. That doesn't usually happen with small bass with fry, but as they get bigger, it happens quite frequently. And again, as they get bigger, I start feeding them bigger food. I'll go down and buy a bunch of minnows. I'll buy night crawlers. That's really their primary food source. Over the years, I've tried to raise them on fish food. You can buy different types of food. You can buy a floating catfish food. I never had any luck with that. But there's another type of food. It's called freshwater food, food designed to be, for bass, bluegills, crappies. Now, I haven't gotten them to eat that, but they still prefer, wild, insects, minnows, and worms. And that's really what I've tried to stay with. But what happens when they get to be anywhere from 3 to 4 inches, maybe after you've had them for a couple of months, you'll start to see kind of an organization take place. They won't all grow at the same rate. As a matter of fact, and this happens quite frequently, 3 or 4 of them will be eaters, and they'll eat everything. Every scrap of food that you put in there, they'll try to scarf up, and sometimes there'll be 1 or 2 that just kind of get left behind. And because of that, the other ones will grow. And sometimes it doesn't take long. Sometimes in just a few short weeks, 3 or 4 of them being very aggressive and a couple of them not so aggressive, pretty soon the ones that are aggressive will be twice as big as the ones that aren't aggressive. And then you'll go out one morning and you used to have 6, now you have 5. And then maybe the next day you have 4. Because the more these bass eat, the bigger they get. And if you're not eating right along with them, if you're not keeping up with them, you're probably going to eventually get eaten. And contrary to what some people might think, bass are cannibalistic. They will eat their brothers and sisters. Bass will eat anything. And if you watch them in an aquarium, you'll see that pretty quickly. You'd be surprised at the number of times that I'll find, some kind of a bug out in the yard, or my wife will find some worms while she's digging around in her gardens. And, no matter where it came from, what kind of bug it is, we drop it in there and they eat it. Big, black, ugly spider, they don't care. They'll eat it. You find a roach, any kind of a roach, big, fat roach, throw it in there, they'll fight over it. They'll rip it apart. They'll eat, like I say, just about anything. But here's what makes them so unique. Out of those 6 bass, if all 6 survive, or 5 survive, or 4 survive, there'll be one bass that's the boss. He will be the king. That's what I learned watching them in the tank. He will be the one that eats first. He will be the one that kind of pushes the others around. He will be the one that determines the direction of the pack. He'll become the leader. And that's an important thing to consider when you're out there fishing. I've had a lot of people say, well, big bass are loners, or you'll never find more than one big fish in one spot because they don't like to be around other fish. Well, some of that might be true. I've heard biologists say that there are certain bass that, for whatever reason, they just prefer to be alone, and they'll travel alone. But most of your bass are schooling fish. They're accustomed to being in a school, and they're more comfortable in a school. A lot of people don't realize there's a benefit to being in a school of fish, and that benefit comes in the form of protection. When you're in a school of however many fish, 12, 15, it's easier to corral bait fish. Bass are smart enough, they're like a pack of wolves. They'll surround that school of fish, and when they attack, the bait fish have nowhere to go. Much harder when they're alone. Much harder to be that lone wolf and attack the same school of fish. So there are benefits. There's also benefits from predators. If you're part of a school and an eagle flies down or an osprey flies down and decides to grab a fish, you could argue you have a chance 1 in 10 or 1 in 15, whatever the size of the school, but your chances are better than if you're all by yourself. Because if you're all by yourself, you're the one they're coming down to get. So being in a school like that, somebody has to be in charge. And there's always going to be one bass that's going to step up, and he's going to be the boss. He's going to be the guy in charge. He's going to be the guy that says, let's go this way, or let's go this way. Bass often travel in these packs. You'll see them a lot of times. I've seen them a million times. Schools of bass. And there might be a school of 1-pounders, 2-pounders, 3-pounders. As a rule, bass will school based on size. I suppose the reason for that is you're probably not going to find 1-pound fish, a fish that's 12 inches, with a school of 5-pounders. And the reason's pretty obvious, because they'll probably eat him. So he's going to school with fish that are similar in size. Quite often, when I see these schools, they'll be blowing up on the surface on a school of bait fish. They'll run the bait fish right up to the surface, and then they'll attack. And when they attack, I mean, it's incredible to watch. And you can throw almost anything at them, and you'll catch one. But it doesn't last long. I mean, you might get in 2 casts if you're lucky, and then it settles down, and all of a sudden you see them over here, or you see them over here, because they're not going to stop. They're on a feeding spree, and they're feeding as a school. But somebody, one of those bass is in charge. He's the one that's telling them, let's go over here, let's go over here, let's attack. So I'd have never known that if I wouldn't have raised bass in an aquarium. And I think it's an interesting thing that I've observed, and it's surprising. There's dozens of other things I've learned watching fish like this, particularly bass, that have helped me to become a better fisherman. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed my little story here about raising bass in an aquarium. If you did, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Got a lot more coming, a lot more great stories. And if you have any comments, maybe you've raised a bass or bass and bluegill or a number of different fish in aquariums, or maybe you have some questions about it. I actually wrote a book a couple of years ago, and I called the book The Aquarist. It was a good book, nothing fantastic, didn't make the bestsellers list, but I basically made a chapter for every type of fish that I raised. And I don't know, there's probably 40 or 30 or 40, 50 chapters. And one of the chapters is dedicated to largemouth bass, as there's another chapter dedicated to peacocks. And I've made a few videos. I actually did them a couple of years ago, but didn't really have a lot of equipment at the time. Just took a short video of the fish kind of swimming around in the aquarium. But I plan to do a lot more in the coming days. So if you love to raise fish in aquariums, if you want to learn more about bass fishing or bass in general, again, stay tuned, because there's a lot more to come. Thanks for watching today. I hope you have a great day.